Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise and deliver the critical knowledge you need to be truly informed. Today, we're taking a long, detailed look at one of the most consequential criminal cases in modern American history, the brutal 1989 assault on the Central Park Jogger, a case that resulted in the wrongful conviction of 5 teenagers who became known as the Exonerated Five.
This is really a devastating chapter in judicial history. It's a chronicle not just of a horrific crime, but of how racial bias, a terrifying media frenzy, and frankly, systemic investigative failures combine to shatter young lives.
Yeah.
For you, the listener, this deep dive is a crucial study in how assumptions can just completely replace facts and how difficult it is for the truth to catch up once a false narrative takes hold.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to move beyond those familiar headlines and really understand the intricate timeline, the precise flaws in the investigation, the massive political intervention that followed, and, well, the decades-long struggle required to finally secure exoneration.
We have to start by setting the context. New York City, April 1989. This was a moment of profound public anxiety. Crime rates were peaking, really fueled by the devastation of the crack cocaine epidemic.
Right.
There was this pervasive atmosphere defined by fear, anger, and just a desperate sense of lawlessness.
And on April 19th, that fear was given a terrifying face. Tricia Malley, a 28-year-old investment banker, was jogging alone in Central Park shortly before 9 p.m. Her assault was so savage, so deeply disturbing, it immediately captured the nation's attention. It really crystallized the city's anxieties.
The injuries she sustained were, well, almost beyond comprehension. She was found hours later, stripped naked, gagged, tied up, covered in mud and blood. Medics initially gave her very little chance of survival.
You thought she'd die or be in a coma permanently.
Exactly. They predicted she would either die or remain in a permanent coma.
And the physical evidence of the violence is just stunning. She lost 75 to 80% of her blood, needed multiple life-saving surgeries, sustained severe brain damage. Her skull was fractured in 21 places.
21 places. Injuries that even dislodged her left eye from its socket. This wasn't just an attack. It was a near-fatal act of torture.
Just horrific.
And the focus of the investigation that followed, unfortunately, immediately broadened. It shifted away from simply finding the person who did this.
Right, the actual perpetrator.
Yes. It shifted towards generating a narrative about, rounding up the usual suspects and asserting order in a city that felt like it was spiraling out of control. This ultimately became a study in how the judicial process can fail catastrophically when racial profiling and institutional pressure just supersede due process.
So let's begin by examining the scene that night and the immediate arrests. It's really vital to frame Malley's assault not as a singular event, but as the most violent part of a much larger night of chaos in the park.
That's right. Sources indicate a large group of teenagers, estimated somewhere between 20 to 32 individuals, mostly from East Harlem, had entered the north end of the park between 9 and 10 p.m. that evening.
And police were getting calls right away.
Oh, yes. Numerous reports in rapid succession. Muggings, attacks on cyclists, people being accosted, rocks thrown at cars, general mayhem.
And one of the other documented victims that night was John Laughlin. He was beaten pretty badly, too.
Very badly. He was intercepted, knocked down, kicked, punched, and beaten with a pipe and a stick. The initial police reports described his state as utterly shocking. One officer actually testified that Laughlin looked like he had been dunked in a bucket of blood.
Terrible.
So quickly, police began detaining and bringing in 6 teenagers. Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, Corey Wise, and Stephen Lopez.
And location played a part.
It seems so. A geographical factor definitely played a role. 4 of them lived at Schomburg Plaza, which is a nearby mixed-income housing complex. It made them immediate, sort of easy targets for police sweeping the area near the crime.
And this immediately brings us to maybe the most troubling aspect of the entire investigation, the interrogations themselves.
Absolutely. None of these boys, and remember, most of them were legally juveniles, under 16, none had defense attorneys present.
No lawyers.
No lawyers. And critically, they were held and interrogated for at least 7 hours before the videotaped confessions even began on April 21st.
7 hours.
Yeah.
Before the camera was rolling.
Those 7 unrecorded hours. That's the investigative scandal right at the heart of this injustice. This is where the vulnerability of young people is just exploited. We know now, based on decades of psychological research, that children and teenagers are exponentially more likely than adults to provide false confessions under pressure.
Why is that? Is it just fear?
It's a combination of things. They're less capable of long-term thinking, they're more obedient to authority figures like police officers, and they're much more susceptible to suggestion. They want the questioning to stop.
So what exactly happens during those crucial, unrecorded hours? How do they get a kid to confess to something they didn't do?
Well, detectives employ these well-documented psychological tactics. They use maximization that's grossly exaggerating the severity of the crime and the evidence against the suspect, sometimes even lying at the evidence.
Like they did with Salam.
Exactly. Then they use minimization. This involves seeming sympathetic, suggesting maybe the crime was an accident or that the suspect was just an accomplice, maybe forced into the situation.
Trying to make it seem less bad.
Precisely. And for a frightened, exhausted kid, the promise of just being allowed to go home if they tell us what we need to hear, that's an overwhelming incentive to comply. Just make it stop.
And we see that maximization tactic so clearly in Yusuf Salam's case. Detective Tom McKenna, looking for a break, just straight up lied, told Salam his fingerprints were found on the victim's clothing.
A classic, devastating false evidence tactic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this desperation for a clear narrative, for something the media could grab onto, led to the term that really defined the initial case: wilding.
Ah, yes. Wilding.
The senior police claim the suspects used this term to describe their rampaging through the park.
And that word just took off. It
Yeah.
instantly dehumanized the suspects, didn't it? It fed right into the public fear, painting them as, like, subhuman, organized savages.
That's the critical cultural insight here. Investigative reporter Barry Michael Cooper, who was actually close to the hip-hop scene at the time, heavily disputed where that term came from.
What did he say?
He suggested it came from a detective mishearing, or maybe misunderstanding the phrase "doing the wild thing," which were lyrics from Tom Locke's huge hit song back then.
Right, wilding.
Exactly. So whether it was intentional or just an accidental mishearing, the police adoption of wilding instantly created this terrifying, easy-to-digest narrative of indiscriminate youth violence. And the media just ate it up. It fueled their hunger for a quick conviction.
So when we finally get to those videotape statements, the supposed confessions, we run into this massive legal and factual problem. While the boys did implicate themselves in being part of the larger group committing other acts that night.
The muggings, the other assaults.
Right, but none of them actually confessed to the rapes itself.
That's the key legal loophole the prosecution ended up leveraging, the idea of accomplice liability. Each of the 5 implicated in the rape confessed only to being an accomplice.
So they said they held her down or touched her.
Exactly. They said they were restraining the jogger or maybe sexually touching her, while one or more others committed the actual penetrative rape. This clever, or perhaps cynical, approach allowed the prosecution to secure a rape conviction without having a confession from a principal rapist.
But even those accomplice stories, they were full of holes, weren't they?
Oh, completely. They contained troubling discrepancies, according to the later analysis by the DA's office. The accounts varied wildly regarding when, where, and how it happened.
They didn't match up.
Not at all. The stories didn't align with the geography of the crime scene or even with each other. It became pretty clear later that these were stories built on police suggestion, exhaustion, fear, not actual recollection of events.
And you noted that only Corey Wise, who was the oldest at 16, had actually been taken to the crime scene before he gave his statement. Why is that detail so important?
Because that's textbook contamination of a confession. By taking him to the scene before the video rolled, they exposed a vulnerable suspect to details, the locations, the physical layout of the area.
So he could then repeat them back.
Exactly. He could parrot those details back in his videotaped statement, making his coerced confession sound far more authentic and informed than it actually was. It looks convincing, but it's manufactured.
And despite all this, the coercion, the inconsistencies, all 5, McRae, Richardson, Salam, Santana, and Wise, they recanted within weeks. They said they were intimidated, that their Miranda rights were violated.
They did, but the damage is already done. The narrative was set.
Which brings us to the next phase. The case immediately became this media and political lightning rod. The city was already gripped by fear, and it was incredibly receptive to any narrative that promised swift retribution. The sheer brutality of the attack provoked just great outrage. It solidified the public's appetite for punishment.
And the media Well, unfortunately, they really led the charge, starting with a fundamental breach of legal policy. Standard police procedure required withholding the names, photos, and addresses of juvenile suspects, anyone under 16, to protect them and their families.
But that didn't happen here.
Not at all. That policy was completely ignored. The information was released to the press before the boys were even formally arraigned,
Wow.
which resulted in immediate and serious threats against the suspects and their families, particularly those living right there at Schaumburg Plaza. This deliberate violation of privacy, likely rooted in a desire to publicly shame and identify the accused, it had long-lasting repercussions.
And the racial dynamic was just impossible to ignore. The 5 suspects were Black and Hispanic kids. The victim was a white, successful investment banker.
Right. And the Reverend Calvin O. Butts really articulated the deep historical context at the time. He stated quite bluntly that the default reaction in America when a white woman is attacked is to round up a bunch of Black youths. He suggested racial profiling was the very foundation of the investigation from the start.
The bias in the coverage was apparently so extreme.
It was, so much so that African-American newspapers back then, like the City Sun and Amsterdam News, they actually made the conscious, controversial decision to publicly identify Trisha Miley, who hadn't been named in the mainstream press, as a direct response.
Why did they do that?
Their argument was, essentially, if the privacy of these young, accused minors could be so blatantly breached by the mainstream media, then the victims should also be named. It was an attempt, however controversial, to balance what they saw as a profoundly skewed, race-driven narrative.
And this issue of media racial bias is so crucial. We have to remind you, the listener, that just weeks later, on May 3rd, 1989, over in Brooklyn, an equally horrific crime occurred. A 39-year-old Black woman was robbed, raped, and then thrown from a 4-story roof.
And that crime received almost no national media attention whatsoever, barely a blip.
The contrast is just stark.
It's perhaps the clearest evidence of racial bias in media empathy. The city, the nation, was focused on this narrative of perceived white vulnerability versus aggressive minority youth. A crime against a minority victim, no matter how savage, just didn't fit the desired political narrative of law and order that the public discourse was demanding at that moment.
And speaking of that political discourse, the pressure on the justice system intensified dramatically about 10 days after the confessions, when certain real estate magnate decided to weigh in, Donald Trump.
Yes, Trump took out full-page advertisements in all 4 major city newspapers. The New York Times, the Daily News, the Post, Newsday. This wasn't some small editorial piece. This was a massive, expensive intervention.
And expensive.
Costing an estimated $85,000 back in 1989 dollars, which, translates to well over $216,000 in today's money. It was a visual and rhetorical bombshell dropped into the middle of the case.
And the content was just incredibly inflammatory, calling for the return of the death penalty, demanding suffering.
Absolutely. He wrote, quote, "I want to hate these muggers and murderers. They should be forced to suffer." His central argument, laid out in huge letters, was that criminals' civil liberties end when an attack on our safety begins.
Basically saying, forget due process.
Pretty much. This was a direct, high-profile attempt to poison the potential jury pool and exert political pressure on the judicial process. Defense counsel William Warren later confirmed that Trump's ad poisoned the minds of many people who lived in New York City.
How could it not?
Exactly. When potential jurors came in for selection, how could they possibly claim impartiality after seeing a major public figure essentially demanding these boys suffer, demanding their execution? It amplified the sense that the verdict was already decided by the public long before any evidence was even presented in court.
So, despite the defense lawyers challenging the confessions, arguing they were coerced, rights were violated. Judge Thomas B. Galligan ruled the statements were voluntary and admissible.
Yes, that ruling was crucial. It set the stage for the 2 trials, which were bifurcated, split up.
Why split them up?
The prosecution strategically tried the 6 defendants in 2 separate groups. McRae, Salam, and Santana were in the first trial. Richardson and Wise were in the second. This was done specifically to control the introduction of evidence and testimony, basically maximizing their chances for conviction in both instances. It's a tactical move.
This also brings us to the critical topic of forensic evidence at the time. DNA analysis was available. It was still somewhat new, right? What did the earliest testing actually tell us?
That's a key point. The The DNA analysis, even at that early stage, indicated that none of the 6 suspects matched the semen collected from the crime scene, specifically from Maylee's cervix and also from a running sock found nearby.
So it excluded them.
It was exclusionary evidence. It clearly excluded them as the source of the sexual assault material.
But how was this incredibly important information presented to the jury? Did they hear it excludes them?
No. And this is where we see the strategic, frankly, manipulation of evidence. The police and the prosecution strategically reported the DNA results as inconclusive.
Inconclusive. That sounds very different from excluded.
It's a world of difference. Inconclusive implies, well, we just don't know. Maybe they did it, maybe they didn't, the science can't tell us. The reality was the DNA excluded them. It pointed definitively toward an unidentified male perpetrator who was not one of these 6 boys.
So by labeling it inconclusive,
they effectively sidelined the strongest piece of forensic evidence pointing toward the boys' innocence of the rape. It allowed the trial to focus almost solely on those coerced, inconsistent confessions.
So in the first trial, McCrae, Salam, and Santana, they were acquitted of attempted murder, but convicted of the assault and rape of Maylee and also the assault and robbery of John Laughlin.
Correct. They received the maximum juvenile term at the time, 10 years.
And the second trial involved Richardson and Wise. Corey Wise's situation was particularly complex.
It was. Wise was 16 at the time of the crime, just over the juvenile threshold for certain charges. While he was acquitted of the most serious charges, rape and attempted murder, he was convicted of lesser charges like assault and riot. But because of his age and the felony nature of those charges, he was tried and sentenced as an adult.
An adult sentence for a 16-year-old.
Yes, he received 5 to 15 years to be served in adult prison. Richardson, in that same trial, was the only one of the 5 ultimately convicted of the attempted murder charge related to Maylee.
Given the shaky confessions and the, let's say, massaged DNA evidence, what actually swayed these juries? What do they point to?
It's fascinating and honestly frightening. Jurors interviewed later actually admitted they were not convinced by the highly contradictory confessions. They saw the problems there.
So what did convince them?
Instead, they focus on the non-DNA physical evidence. Specifically, some grass, some dirt, and 2 hairs found on Kevin Richardson's underpants. The evidence was presented in court as 2 hairs being consistent with the victim's hair.
Consistent with, not a match.
Exactly. That kind of subjective forensic science, the microscopic comparison of hair samples, which we now know is notoriously unreliable, was somehow deemed more convincing than the boys' consistent denials and the problems with the confessions.
And we now know.
We now know, of course, thanks to much more advanced DNA testing years later, that those hairs did not match the victim either. They weren't hers.
Unbelievable. So the convictions that sent 5 young men to prison for years rested almost entirely on evidence that was either coerced, manipulated, or later proven to be completely false.
Precisely. And we shouldn't overlook Stephen Lopez in all this. He was the 6th teenager initially arrested. He ended up taking a plea deal.
What did he plead to?
He pleaded guilty only to the mugging of John Laughlin, the other victim that night. He received 1.5 to 4.5 years in a juvenile facility. Critically, the rape charges against him were dropped entirely.
Why were they dropped?
Because the prosecution themselves conceded their case against him for the rape was too weak. Lopez had consistently denied any knowledge of the rape in his statement, unlike the others who gave those coerced accomplice accounts. His plea deal kind of underscores the haphazard and desperate nature of the prosecution's entire strategy. They took what they could get.
Okay, let's turn now to the moment of truth, really. The decades-long road to exoneration and the discovery of the actual assailant. It's essential to reiterate that throughout their time in prison, the 5 men, McCrae, Richardson, Salam, Santana, and Wise, consistently maintained their innocence regarding Trisha Maylee's attack.
They did, even while, importantly, admitting their involvement in other wrongdoing that night. The muggings, the assaults on other people in the park. They weren't claiming to be angels, but they insisted they did not attack the jogger.
And of the 5, Corey Wise's experience was particularly brutal.
His fate was arguably the most tragic. Sentenced as an adult at 16, he served a full 13 years, mostly in notoriously violent adult prisons like Rikers Island and Auburn. He was often placed in solitary confinement, sometimes for his own protection as a juvenile convicted of a high-profile rape. He was a target, and sometimes because of the violence he endured, and, understandably, sometimes retaliated against.
13 years.
He was the last of the 5 to be released in August 2002. You just have to try and imagine the horror of a 16-year-old boy spending his entire youth and young adulthood in maximum security adult prisons for a crime he absolutely did not commit.
The discovery of the real perpetrator, Matias Reyes. It really does sound like something out of a crime novel. It seems driven by this extraordinary twist of fate.
It really does feel like fate intervening, perhaps. In 2001, Reyes, who was already a convicted serial rapist and killer, he had attacked 5 other women in 1989 alone, including one he murdered, was incarcerated at Auburn Correctional Facility in upstate New York.
The same prison as Wise.
Exactly. He encountered Corey Wise there, and subsequently, Reyes informed a corrections officer, apparently somewhat out of the blue, that he, Matias Reyes, was the sole person responsible for the Central Park Jogger assault and rape back in '89.
Wow. Just an unsolicited confession from a known serial predator. Did he offer any details? Anything that could be checked out?
He provided the most crucial piece of corroborating evidence imaginable. Reyes confessed to assaulting and raping Maylee completely alone, and he provided specific details about the crime scene that had never been publicly released.
Such as?
Specifically, he described how he had tied up Maylee using her own t-shirt in a very distinctive fashion, a particular binding technique. And crucially, it was a technique he had used again on later victims in crimes for which he had already been convicted. Only the true perpetrator would have known that specific, gruesome detail.
And then came the DNA confirmation. The final, undeniable proof.
It was absolutely definitive. Reyes' DNA was analyzed, and it matched the semen found both in and on Trisha Maylee. It confirmed him as the sole source of the DNA from the sexual assault.
Sole source.
Sole source. The certainty level was just staggering. The report said, to a factor of 1 in 6 billion people, 6 billion, there was zero scientific doubt left. Reyes did it. Alone. The 5 teenagers were innocent of the sexual assault.
It is truly jarring, though, that despite this confession and the definitive DNA evidence, Matias Reyes was never actually charged with the attack on Trisha Maylee. How is that even possible?
That's down to a terrible legal loophole in New York state law at the time. The statute of limitations for the specific offense of rape back then was only 5 years.
Only 5 years.
Yes. The attack had occurred in 1989. Reyes confessed in 2001, 12 years later. By the time he confessed and the DNA confirmed his guilt, the legal window for charging him with that specific crime had closed. It's a legal technicality, but it was a profound shock to the system. It meant the man clearly responsible for this horrific violence could never be held accountable for it in court.
So following Reyes' confession and the DNA match, the Manhattan District Attorney, Robert Morgenthau, commissioned a new investigation. This was led by Assistant DA Nancy Ryan to review the entire case history from scratch.
Yes, and Ryan's investigation was incredibly comprehensive and ultimately decisive. Her office determined that the 5 boys' original confessions were not only irreconcilably inconsistent with each other, which was already known, but also fundamentally contradicted established physical facts from the crime scene and were completely incompatible with Reyes' verified sole involvement.
Did her team look into where the boys actually were that night, their movements?
They did, and crucially, their investigation confirmed, using timelines and locations from the boys' own statements about the other crimes, that the teenagers were either spectating or actively participating in those other crimes, the muggings, the assaults on Laughlin, and others elsewhere in the park.
At the same time?
At the precise time Maylee's rape occurred miles away in a different section of the park. This made their participation in her specific assault functionally impossible. They couldn't be in 2 places at once.
This overwhelming evidence led the court to finally vacate the convictions in December 2002. But the court didn't just vacate the rape convictions. It vacated all of them, right?
Well,
including the convictions for the other assaults and robberies they had admitted to.
That's right, a complete vacatur.
Why this sweeping reversal? Why not just the rape?
This was a critical legal point argued successfully by Nancy Ryan and accepted by the court. The DA's office determined that the boys' false rape confessions, which were clearly extracted via coercion, were inextricably intertwined with their admissions to the other crimes made during the same interrogation sessions.
So you couldn't separate them.
Exactly. Since the coerced confessions were used as the primary tainted foundation to convict them of everything that happened that night, the reliability of all the associated convictions was fundamentally destroyed. You couldn't reliably disentangle the truth admissions to mugging, from the lies extracted under duress, the false rape confessions. Therefore, legally, all convictions stemming from those tainted interrogations had to be vacated.
Was there significant political backlash to vacating those lesser crime convictions? Especially since the boys themselves admitted they were involved in some lawlessness that night.
Oh, absolutely. The decision was highly controversial, especially among segments of the NYPD, particularly the original detectives involved and parts of the public. Many people felt the boys should still face justice for the other attacks they admitted to.
But legally?
Legally, the standard holds that if the foundation of the prosecution in this case, coercion leading to false confessions and suppression of exculpatory evidence, is rotten, the entire structure built upon it must fall. It was ultimately a vindication of due process over public sentiment and political pressure.
So the exoneration finally cleared their names completely, allowing them to be removed from the New York State Sex Offender Registry, which must have been a devastating barrier to rebuilding their lives.
Huge, a practical necessity.
And we should also note that even Stephen Lopez's original robbery plea deal was eventually overturned decades later by DA Alvin Bragg in July 2022. That completed the sweep of justice for all 6 of the original suspects.
So now we enter the phase of aftermath and, importantly, conflicting narratives. Because the story absolutely did not end with the exoneration in 2002. The DA's decision to vacate was immediately and very strongly opposed by many inside the NYPD.
Especially the original detectives.
Yes, particularly the original detectives involved in the 1989 investigation, who continued to claim they did nothing wrong. This institutional resistance led directly to the commissioning of the Armstrong Report.
Right, commissioned by the police commissioner at the time, Raymond Kelly, in January 2003. What was its purpose?
Its stated purpose was to review the original investigation in light of the exoneration. But in practice, the report reads like a masterclass in institutional damage control.
How so?
Well, the panel writing the report stated they did not dispute the legal necessity of vacating the rape convictions based on Reyes's definitive DNA match. They couldn't argue with the science. However...
There's always a however.
There's always a however. They vehemently disputed Reyes's claim that he acted alone.
So what theory did the NYPD put forward? How did they try to maintain the original assertion of guilt, even with Reyes's DNA confession?
They constructed this alternative multi-perpetrator scenario. The Armstrong report concluded the 5 men most likely participated alongside Reyes. They argued the most likely scenario was that both the defendants and Reyes assaulted her, perhaps successively.
So maybe the boys attacked her first, or maybe after Reyes?
Exactly. They suggested Reyes was involved, sure, the DNA proved that, but maybe the 5 boys had participated in a preceding or subsequent attack that didn't involve the specific sexual act Reyes confessed to.
What evidence did they point to for this theory? Anything concrete?
They pointed mainly to the sheer number and severity of the blunt force injuries Maley suffered, suggesting that one man, Reyes, acting alone, couldn't possibly have inflicted all of them. They also re-emphasized the presence of that large group of teenagers confirmed to be in the park causing trouble that night, arguing their presence was just too coincidental to dismiss entirely.
So circumstantial arguments.
Very much so. And the report, rather incredibly, concluded there was no misconduct in the 1989 police investigation. A finding that seems designed solely to protect the institutional integrity and reputation of the NYPD. They basically dismissed Reyes, stating, quote, "The word of a serial rapist killer is not something to be heavily relied upon, even though his DNA and specific knowledge proved his involvement."
So even with undeniable forensic proof of innocence for the 5 on the rape, the official police response was essentially to generate a counter-narrative, one that allowed them to save face and uphold their original, perhaps race-driven assumptions of guilt.
It's a really stark, enduring example of institutional confirmation bias. The refusal of an organization to admit a catastrophic error, even when faced with overwhelming objective evidence.
Meanwhile, the 5 men, now exonerated, sued New York City in federal court in 2003. They sued for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and claimed a racially motivated conspiracy, seeking $52 million in damages.
And the city, under Mayor Michael Bloomberg at the time, fought that lawsuit tooth and nail. For years, they initially refused to even consider settling.
What was Bloomberg's argument?
The Bloomberg administration argued that the defendants had received a fair trial back in 1990 and that the NYPD had acted appropriately based on the information they had at that time. They resisted admitting any fault. That legal battle consumed over a decade of the men's lives after they were already proven innocent.
The breakthrough finally came only after Mayor Bill de Blasio took office. He signaled a different approach, a recognition of the profound injustice.
That's right. In 2014, the city finally settled the federal lawsuit for $41 million.
A landmark settlement.
Huge. And it was carefully calculated, apparently, to account for the unique circumstances of each man's wrongful incarceration. Corey Wise, for instance, received the highest individual amount, $12.2 million, specifically acknowledging those 6 additional years he served in the brutal adult prison system compared to his juvenile counterparts.
Did the city admit wrongdoing in the settlement?
No, that was a key point. The city explicitly did not admit wrongdoing as part of the settlement agreement. They framed it more as fulfilling a moral obligation to respond to that injustice, rather than a legal admission of fault by the police or prosecutors.
And the 5 men didn't stop there. They also sued New York State.
Correct. They subsequently sued the state, settling that separate lawsuit in 2016 for an additional $3.9 million. This acknowledged the role the state's justice system, the courts, the prison system played in the economic and emotional devastation they suffered.
Now, throughout this, we absolutely must consider the voice and experience of the victim, Tricia Maley.
Yes, it's crucial. Despite her near-fatal injuries, she survived. She undertook this harrowing, years-long recovery process, coping with severe, lingering disabilities, including significant memory loss, balance issues, vision problems, a truly courageous journey.
And she eventually went public with her identity.
She did. In 2003, coinciding with the exonerations, she publicly confirmed her identity with her memoir, I Am the Central Park Jogger, a story of hope and possibility. She's since become a powerful, inspirational speaker, focusing on resilience and recovery.
What has her public perspective been on the exoneration itself?
It's complex. She has stated publicly that she wished the case had been retried after Rhea's confession, rather than just settled out of court. And she has also maintained publicly her belief that her attack was likely not the result of just a single person.
Why do you think that is, even with the DNA?
Well, it highlights the enduring psychological power of the initial narrative presented by the state. We have to remember, Tricia Maley has no memory of the attack itself due to her injuries. For over a decade, the entire city, the media, the justice system told her and the world that these 5 boys were responsible. Even after DNA proved one man, Reyes, committed the sexual assault, the sheer scale of her trauma and the sheer length of time that false narrative persisted likely make it incredibly difficult for her psychologically to accept that only one person could have inflicted that level of horrific violence. The narrative was just so deeply ingrained.
And finally, in this aftermath section, we have to address the most enduring and, frankly, politically charged element of the post-exoneration narrative, Donald Trump's continued stance on the case.
Right. Despite the definitive DNA evidence, despite the city paying a massive $41 million settlement in 2014, specifically because the men were innocent, Trump publicly called that settlement a disgrace. He stated the men were still likely guilty.
He just refused to accept the exoneration.
Completely. This consistency, or perhaps stubbornness, is key. During his 2016 presidential campaign, he repeatedly maintained that the Exonerated Five were guilty and should never have been cleared. He kept insisting they admitted their guilt, ignoring the entire context of coercion and false confessions.
It was a deliberate attempt to invalidate a legally settled miscarriage of justice.
Absolutely. And that denial continued long into his political career. It even led to further legal action. Following Trump's own indictment in Manhattan in 2023, Yusuf Salaam reacted publicly with just a single word, karma.
Wow.
Highlighting the irony, right? The cycle of justice and political intervention in justice continuing to play out in the very same city and legal venues where the original injustice began. And this culminated just recently in October 2024 with the Exonerated Five actually suing Donald Trump for defamation for his relentless, continued public claims of their guilt over all these years.
The story just keeps evolving. Okay, let's turn now to the lasting legacy of this deep dive.
Yeah.
The impact on justice reform and, of course, the lives of the Exonerated Five themselves.
Yes. The ability to finally clear their names, legally and publicly, led to immediate practical relief for them. Crucially, they were removed from the state's sex offender registry.
Which must have been incredibly damaging.
Devastating. It created near impossible barriers to getting jobs, finding housing, getting education. Just basic life necessities. Getting off that registry was huge. And subsequently, they have become incredibly prominent advocates for criminal justice reform.
In different ways, right?
Yes. Raymond Santana and Kevin Richardson, for instance, they actively campaign against the use of false confessions and the problems with eyewitness misidentification, key issues in their case. Yusuf Salaam has become a truly nationally recognized voice. He serves on the board of the Innocence Project. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award from President Obama.
And he won a seat on the New York City Council.
In a truly profound political victory, yes. In November 2023, he won a seat representing Harlem on the New York City Council, bringing him right back into the heart of the very system that so catastrophically failed him decades earlier. A remarkable turn of events.
And Corey Wise, whose experience in the adult prison system was, as we discussed, arguably the most horrific. His response has also been incredible.
It really has. He demonstrated this amazing capacity for, well, forgiveness isn't quite the right word, but for systemic thinking, for wanting to prevent this from happening to others. He donated a significant portion of his settlement money, $190,000, to the Innocence Project at the University of Colorado Law School.
And they renamed it.
They renamed it in his honor. It's now the Corey Wise Innocence Project. It's just such a powerful testament to turning profound personal suffering into enduring systemic change aimed at protecting other vulnerable people.
The case itself, the Central Park Jogger case, is now globally cited, isn't it, as like the definitive example of the severe problem of false confessions.
Absolutely, especially highlighting the extreme vulnerability of juveniles when subjected to high-pressure, lengthy, unrecorded police interrogation tactics.
And did the massive public scrutiny, combined with the undeniable clarity of the DNA exoneration, actually lead to changes in the law?
It did eventually. It took time, but yes, it drove substantive legislative reform. New York State, along with about 24 other states now, have since passed laws requiring the electronic recording of full police interrogations, especially for serious felonies.
When did that take effect in New York?
It became effective in New York in April 2018. This change directly addresses the fundamental failure back in 1989, ensuring that those crucial initial hours of questioning, the hours where coercion is most likely to occur, are no longer hidden, unrecorded, and therefore unaccountable. Transparency is key. So as we synthesize everything we've looked at today, what does this deep dive ultimately reveal for you, the listener? I think it shows the profound fragility of confession evidence, especially when it's extracted from vulnerable populations like teenagers under immense pressure.
And the power of the media narrative.
Exactly. We saw the destructive influence of media narratives, how they can be shaped and driven by things like the inflammatory rhetoric of powerful public figures like Donald Trump back in '89, and the profound, undeniable impact of racial bias, where one crime against a white victim becomes a national obsession, while an equally brutal crime against a minority victim just weeks later is almost completely ignored.
This case really is just such a painful illustration of how easily a justice system, maybe desperate for convictions in a city gripped by fear and demanding action, can completely override due process. How it can lead directly to wrongful convictions rooted in racial assumptions and fueled by coerced lies.
And it took so long. Years and years, definitive DNA evidence that couldn't be ignored, and ultimately the conscience of the actual perpetrator stepping forward to slowly, painfully begin to unravel that original lie.
Which leads us, I think, to our final thought for you to consider. We've reviewed the definitive facts. DNA proved Matias Reyes was the sole rapist. The city of New York paid millions of dollars in settlement precisely because the 5 men were wrongfully convicted.
And yet, alternative narratives persist. You have the NYPD's Armstrong report insisting they likely participated alongside Reyes. You have persistent political claims, particularly from Donald Trump, continuing to question the innocence of the Exonerated Five, even today.
So the question is?
The question this leaves us with is really fundamental, especially today. In a world seemingly saturated with information and disinformation, why do some narratives, once they become established, especially narratives rooted in prejudice, in fear, in institutional self-preservation, why do they continue to resist definitive, forensic, objective evidence?
And what responsibility does the legal system itself have when powerful public figures actively work year after year to undermine the validity of its final rulings, long after the law has technically spoken and the case is closed?
That ongoing struggle, that tension between proven fact and persistent prejudice, that's something we all, I think, must continue to grapple with and explore.